terms of living birds, most fly, but not all of them. There are some examples of flightless birds, many of which are ratites, which is a group of birds that includes the ostrich and the emu, those giant flightless birds that mostly move by running, the penguins, and then there are a few others in some different groups. But for the most part, birds fly, and so they have adaptations that make them good at flying, things like hollow bones, very powerful pectoral muscles, which help flap their wings, attached to a specialized sternum that has a keel that sticks out to hold that extra pectoral muscle, and obviously feathers are found in all birds. Here's a look at an emu, which you find in Australia, and it looks, ridiculous, but it still has feathers and a beak and some scales in the legs, etc., that you find in all birds, but it does not fly. Still has wings, but they're kind of held back under this big, pile of feathers. They're pretty fast runners, but they're heavier than normal birds, not just because they're larger, but most birds have hollow bones and lots of adaptations to make them light. These guys have fewer of those, and so they're not as light. But it provides them with some strength in their skeleton to run fast. But flight requires specific things out of an organism, right? One, it's very energy intensive. But two, because of the demands of aerodynamics and the demands of making your body lighter, most flying birds look relatively similar to one another, at least in body form. But that said, there is some diversity. So here is a hummingbird, right? These guys have incredible metabolisms, and they are able to hover, right? But they are very, very tiny and have very long beaks to get the nectar inside of flowers like this. And we have our pink flamingos, which have very, very long legs and long necks, so that they can stand in water, but also lean down and grab shrimp and things like that. This is more of a standard flighted bird body pattern that you would see. Long tail, wings, etc. And a penguin has its own unique look, right? It looks in a lot of ways like those flighted birds, and it even looks, when it's moving, like it's flying through the water, right? It flaps its wings, but it has very, very different feathers. They're there to insulate the penguin in really, really cold waters rather than to gain airlift, right, to fly. And so they're going to look very, very different. They're also going to be much, much heavier. They have a lot more fat to help insulate their bodies as well. The class Mammalia is a diverse group. We've got more than 5,300 species. You may be familiar with one or two of them. So just another check-in with our phylogeny. Now, these are all chordates, right? This is the common ancestor of all chordates. The first to break off was the subphylum Cephalochordata. And those include lancelets, right? And then the next to break off are urochordates, like sea squirts. And then we have Myxinae, which are the hagfish, and these are craniates, right? At this point, we are craniates. We have a head with a skull around a brain. So chordates with a head and a skull around a brain are craniates. And then around here, we get vertebral column. So we evolve into vertebrates. And Petromezontida is a lamprey, and those are the oldest still living examples of vertebrates, and they don't have jaws. But here we have the last common ancestor of all jawed vertebrates, which we call gnathostomes, and that includes cartilaginous fish like chondrichthyes, and also bony fish like ray fin fish, such as Actinopterygii, and Actinistia, which are lobe-finned fish. And lobe-finned fish include the lungfish, for instance, the coelacanths, dipnoi being the lungfish, and the tetrapods. Tetrapods are lobe-finned fish. We are just lobe-finned fish that have made our way out to terrestrial habitats. Amphibians being the oldest group because they're just part-time in terrestrial habitats. And then we have the amniotes, which have evolved to be full-time in terrestrial habitats because of the amniotic egg and those amniotic membranes, and that includes reptiles, birds are within this group, and now mammals. And mammals are characterized by mammary glands, right? That's where the name comes from. So we make milk. Also hair. when we think of fuzzy animals, we're always thinking of mammals, right? There are other organisms that have things that are kind of like hairs, like spiders, we call them hairy, but those are different kinds of hairs. Those are made of chitin. Those are not fuzzy like our keratin-based hair. We have endothermy, right? We regulate our temperature by metabolism, and so we have a high metabolic rate, kind of like birds. So this isn't unique to humans, but we do have a high metabolic rate. We have a larger brain size than other vertebrates of equivalent size, right? So, very large organisms tend to have very large brains, but brain relative to size, mammals have large brains, tend to be fairly intelligent. And we have differentiated teeth, right? So a lot of organisms have teeth, right? Some fish have teeth, reptiles have teeth, but they have all, sharks have teeth. They have the same kinds of teeth, right? We have incisors and lateral incisors and molars and canines. Not all mammals have exactly the same teeth, but they all have differentiated teeth for different purposes. Additionally, we have 3 little bones in our ears, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, our hammer, anvil, stirrup. And just as much as for our mammary glands, this is one of the unique characteristics of mammals, the synapomorphies, or shared characteristics of mammals. And we evolved from synapsids. And just to remind you what synapsids and diapsids are, right? It has to do with these holes that appear in the skull behind the eyeball. And so amniotes include reptiles and mammals today, but reptiles have branched into diapsids, which have 2, and anapsids, which don't have any. These are all fused. The only example of living anapsids are turtles, right? Whereas diapsids include all living reptiles, including birds. Synapsids, these two kind of came together, and we only have 1 hole back here, and synapsids became mammals. So here's an ancient synapsid, and you can see that these 2 bones that used to be part of the jaw joint became, in modern mammals, part of the ear. So the malleus and the incus were not part of the ear, and present-day reptiles don't have those, right? They only have the stapes to go from the outside eardrum to the inner ear. And this allows us to have better hearing, essentially. We're able to better amplify air vibrations to hear them. And mammals were not super common during the Mesozoic, to the time of the dinosaurs. But toward the end of the Mesozoic, by the early Cretaceous, there were 3 living lineages of mammals. We were all relatively small. We hadn't done a significant adaptive radiation until after the end Cretaceous extinction, that we talked about with the asteroid and all. But those 3 lineages are monotremes, marsupials, and eutherians. Monotremes are weird, and there are not many of them still alive. There are really only a few types of echidnas and the platypus. This is an example of an echidna, and it lays eggs. Monotremes are mammals that lay eggs. The platypus you may be more familiar with also has a bill here. It looks more like a duck on a platypus. And they also lay eggs. And they don't have nipples like most mammals do, but they do produce milk that sort of, they've got these pores, the milk comes out, and their young essentially lap it off of their fur. So they have fur. They look kind of like mammals, except eggs, no nipples, and beaks, right? Really weird. Marsupials are your cute little critters with a pouch, right? They include opossums, kangaroos, koalas. Almost all of these are found in Australia and the islands nearby. There are some found elsewhere. Opossums are North American marsupials, but they are about it. Early on, those continents broke apart, and marsupials were kind of overtaken by eutherians on the rest of the continents, but there were no eutherians on Australia, and so marsupials became the dominant mammals in Australia, and through convergent evolution, there are a lot of marsupials that look a lot like eutherians that we find everywhere else. So they start developing with a placenta in the mother's uterus, kind of like eutherians, but that doesn't last very long. They're born very early in the development, and they kind of climb up the fur into a little pouch, and the pouch is called a marsupium. And then they live in the pouch and nurse from their mother. And when I say early in development, I mean early in development, right? This is a look inside the pouch for a young brush-tailed possum. Now, they'll stay in that pouch for a little while, right? You may be familiar with Kanga and Roo from the Winnie the Pooh universe. Bandicoots are examples of marsupials. If you're Crash Bandicoot fans, this is a long-nosed variety. But they also have a little pouch in the front to hold the young. And though they have been evolving separately for a long time, hundreds of millions of years, there are often very similar mammals in Australia, marsupials, to eutherians that we may be used to. So there's a mole in North America, there's a marsupial mole in Australia that looks very similar. That's not because they have a mole ancestor recently, it's because they both burrow underground and they have a similar niche, a similar habitat, and so they've converged on similar solutions to exploit their resources. A wombat and a woodchuck, a sugar glider and a flying squirrel, Tasmanian devil and a wolverine, right? Even the kangaroo and the Patagonian cavy, which hops in South America. Again, not very related, but they have converged on similar adaptations. So compared with monotremes, which lay eggs, and marsupials, which have a placenta very early on, but are developed largely in the pouch, eutherians are sometimes called placental mammals because they have a very complex placenta. And when I say they, I mean we. We are placental mammals. We have long gestation periods and give live birth to young. So they complete the embryonic development in the uterus, attached to a placenta, and we don't know exactly when the diversification of eutherians happened, but it did happen relatively long ago. And here we zoom in on the orders of eutherian mammals, right? So monotremes, marsupials, and eutherians, placental mammals. You may recognize some of these orders in here. For instance, primates, right? We are more closely related to rodentia, like mice and rats, than we are, for instance, to carnivora, which includes dogs and cats. And there are a bunch of orders of mammals, both monotremes and marsupials, but also eutherians. And I don't need you to know all of them, but it is interesting to look at some, right? Note that, for instance, cetaceans are the eutherians that went back to the ocean, right? And they are most closely related to hooved mammals, right? So cattle and deer and pigs and giraffe, things like that. Chiroptera, the only flying mammals, so those are pretty interesting to look at. And we are going to look a little bit more closely at specifically primates. Why primates? Are they of particular importance? No, we just are going to look at them because we are primates and we are selfishly and appropriately much more interested in our close relatives. And primates include lemurs and tarsiers, which are the more basal primates. They broke off longer ago. Monkeys, and also apes, and we are apes. And primates like us are characterized by having hands and feet that are adapted for grasping. And instead of having curved claws, we have very flat nails, again, so they don't get in the way of our grabbing. We also have short jaws and a large brain, even compared to mammals, which tend to have large brains compared to other organisms. Also, forward-facing eyes, both on the front, so that gives depth perception. Complex social behavior, parental care, things that we're pretty used to, and a fully opposable thumb, not in all primates, but in monkeys and apes. So in the next video, we're going to go into a little bit more detail on the major living groups of primates. So lemurs, lorises, and patos, tarsiers, and then especially anthropoids, which include monkeys and apes. Again, apes being the group that we are a part of.